You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 334 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going, it's cold, but going well, Jeremy.
It is a cold night here, lots of snow everywhere. It's January, it's a brutal deep freeze, and thank goodness, the only thing that helps get us through these times is the
hot stove, stove talk.
The hot stove talk, which just started. You know, it's
my stove's not working. There's no flame. What do I do?
It's amazing that Cubs convention has kind of turned into an artificial deadline for the Cubs to do something. I couldn't imagine if there was no Cubs convention, if they would have done anything leading up to last week. But we've got news, so we're back to talk about news. We'll talk about that Cubs convention. We're going to talk about signings, trades, arbitration. We got a lot to cover. Cubs news finally this winter, and to help us unpack all the news, deep dive into all things Cubs, longtime friend of the show. You know him from his fantastic writings over at his own Substack, as well as CHGO. Jared Wyllys, thanks for coming on to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad that there is finally something to talk about, because it's been a long couple of months.
It has, for sure, and the fun started when the Cubs made their first signing of the offseason. Japanese pitcher Shota Imanaga, 4 years, $53 million contract, a complex deal. There's a lot of things in this deal, including the Cubs have a 3-year team option at some point after 2025. There's a lot of moving pieces of this contract, but the overall summary, 4 years, $53 million. Jared, your thoughts? I know you were at the introductory press conference for Shota. What were your initial impressions and thoughts and on the signing overall?
Yeah, I mean, it was initial thoughts are I think it's a smart move for them because it addresses a need that they had. I think their rotation, the depth of that rotation was a question mark before this signing, and I think as long as he proves to be the kind of pitcher that you think that you're getting, there's always a big variable when you get a guy from Japan and they come over. There's no guarantee that things are going to translate right away. So on paper, at least, I really like this for the depth that it adds to the rotation. I like the fact that he's another lefty, because that's going to make just kind of the back and forth and handedness in the rotation. You can play around with that a little bit. So all that's good. And of course you have to love the way that he carried himself during the press conference. I was there, and, hearing him immediately, his first words were, "Hey, Chicago, what do you say?" And, he was playing they had actually invited the season ticket holders to be there in the press conference. So I think he was kind of playing to them a little bit, but also knowing that the video of this was going to circulate. So nicely ingratiated himself to the fan base pretty quickly. And it is a very, the impression of him just as a person, thoughtful. I think really the word he used to describe himself when he talked to us was he wants to be adaptable. He really talked a lot about knowing that he's going to have adjustments to make in a new league, knowing that he's going to need to grow as a pitcher, which I think is good because, yeah, you've had a lot of success in Japan, but you're coming into a very different kind of league with a lot of other things that you've not dealt with before. So hearing that he has that attitude, I think should be encouraging for fans who might be kind of yes, we're excited, but it's measured enthusiasm, maybe.
I was just going to say, I watched the press conference and I was impressed with his performance. He won me over as from a fan perspective. I thought, he made a real effort, and it seems like a genuinely kind of good guy. He's 30 years old, so I think, I'm glad he wants to make adjustments. I hope he can do it quickly, but he seems mature too. I mean, he's not some 22 or 23-year-old coming here. He's somebody who's a veteran who's pitched for many years in Japan, and has a little bit more, hopefully, veteran gravitas than maybe some younger guys would be. Uh, I will say, when Marcus Stroman opted out of the last year of his deal, and Cubs saved what, 21, $22 million, something like that. I think at that time most Cubs fans were saying, "Hey, great, now we're going to get a top of the rotation guy," right? That was the plan. That's what everybody said on social media. That's Jed Hoyer said we're going to be aggressive in free agency. People are like, now look at all this money the Cubs are saving without Hayward, and now they've got the Stroman money. It was pretty universally believed that the Cubs needed a top of the rotation kind of guy. Did they get a top of the rotation guy? No, I don't think so. I mean, if he ends up being one, then it's the steal of the century. They got a guy who they hope will be a number 3 starter, maybe a number 4 starter. They got him at a good price. Jed wouldn't have signed him otherwise, but they got a middle of the rotation kind of guy at a Jed price. And they're when you look at the pitchers available on the market, that Blake Snell, Jordan Montgomery, those are the top guys there. Even Sonny Gray, who went to the Cardinals, would be in that category. If you look at, I was using the Athletic. They at the preseason they ranked the top 40 free agents, and Shota was ranked 12th. Marcus Stroman was ranked 11th, by the way. So in a sense they were kind of replacing one for one. But I think the Cubs fans and people in the Cubs media universe were expecting more at the beginning of this year, and because the Cubs signed absolutely no one prior to this mid-January signing, I think people were probably overly enthused because they said, "Oh wow, this great," but I don't think that's what people would have said, had you polled them, say, in mid-November. But I guess after waiting several months with no traction, anybody was going to be better than nothing. And so I have high hopes for Shota. I think I am pulling for him. Let's put it that way. I'm pulling for him, but I don't think this is what Cubs fans expected, and probably not what they deserved in terms of there was talk of getting 2 starting pitchers. This would have been the number 2 guy, right? And there's still time, I suppose, to get somebody else, but this was not sort of, if this is what they do to the rotation and that's it, then I don't think that's where they need to be competitive in beyond the NL Central.
Well, and I think it's almost like there's two hurdles they have to clear. The first hurdle is, can you get your roster to a point where you can realistically compete in your division? That's hurdle number 1. But then hurdle number 2 is, can you do anything beyond that? Because we're way past the point where this fan base is going to be content with simply making it to the playoffs. That we've talked about this a lot. That paradigm shifted along many years ago. And it is interesting, I think, because things were so quiet for 2 solid months, like absolutely nothing. That I can see how this may have skewed the reaction or the perception of this signing just a little, because it feels like, oh, here we go, they did something, and it is, he's a legit pitcher. Is he top of the rotation? Definitely not. But he should at least contribute to this rotation pretty significantly. The only thing that I would say for anyone who's kind of thinking like, well, hold on a second, we feel like we're getting gypped a little bit, is when asked Friday evening at the Cubs convention, a few hours after the Imanaga press conference, Jed Hoyer said, we're in the 4th or 5th inning of this offseason. So that's at least those are his words. That's how he is choosing to frame where they're at, where we will find ourselves in another month when the team reports for spring training. We'll see.
Is he anticipating a rain-shortened game?
Yeah. The party left out is that the rain's going to come in and we'll be done after 5 innings. But
it's an official game. I can just see Jed at CubsCon. It's an official game. It's an official game.
Yeah, this counts. This counts, everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think so. And we talked about this actually before the podcast. Jed came out at the beginning of free agency. He didn't have to do this, but he did. And he said that the Cubs plan to be aggressive in free agency. And I think people are excited about that. And look, face it, we all had delusions, I guess, of Ohtani or getting Soto or really upgrading. And there was talk of how the Cubs needed 2 premier bats, one to replace Bellinger, plus one more because they just need one more, and getting pitchers and all the other things that we had hoped for. And I think the tenor's changed a lot. Like even at the Cubs convention, you heard Jed say, talk about wanting to act like a small market or mid-market team and how they spend. And he basically said what everybody has sort of been speculating or griping about, which is, he's basically a bargain hunter. And some would argue, you can't get if you're only looking for bargains, you're not going to get the top players, right? Because that's just not how it works these days. And he's shown over the last couple of years that he's willing to spend money, but usually on guys who fit, who come down in price or whose price was never quite that high to begin with, vis-a-vis others. So even when they got Swanson, which was the big signing of the last 7 years, he was at the time, perceived over that 2-year period to be like the number 7 shortstop or 8 shortstop, and all the other guys went for more. So he was sort of the one who they got at the best deal. And, and Carter kind of reiterated that too in some of his comments. And it does make you wonder if that's going to be the approach. They must really be bullish on the farm system. But they must really think that the guys are going to come up from the farm system and be really good, because otherwise I just don't see how you can justify now. Let's see, this would be year 4 since they traded Darvish and started the teardown. It's really hard to justify another year of mid-tier free agent signings, a couple of them here or there, but also losing people like Bellinger and Stroman too on top of it. So you're not really getting that much, you're kind of basically ending up at even. I don't know. Jared, what's the outlook here?
Yeah. And I think, so first of all, when Jed Hoyer said that, there's a little bit of a surprise that he would use those words to try to describe their approach. Because we've heard some of the other jargon that they've thrown out there, like intelligent spending and things like that. And so that was surprising. And I think my question, as I was thinking about it afterward, is why is it that the Chicago Cubs, with the resources that they have, after everything that this fan base has been told, why is it that their front office is operating that way? My guess would be that Jed Hoyer and Carter Hawkins don't want to operate that way. My speculation would be there's a little bit of they're not choosing that entirely on their own. I'll just put it that way.
This is how you have to spend the budget you're given.
Yes.
They literally have a division for the taking. It's never been worse. It's never been worse.
This is
they spend, if they could spend money now, they could guarantee. You never guarantee in baseball, but they could certainly put themselves in a position to be the runaway front runner for winning the division this year. And they haven't done that, and it's so odd to me.
Well, that's what, and that's kind of what I was getting to. Is it just feels very strange that the team would be operating like this when there are many reasons why they should not be or shouldn't need to be. Because number one, financially, you've done all of the things that you set out to do. You've got your TV network, you own the neighborhood, you know, that's all happened. And yeah, you're right. Like Pat, like this division is as vulnerable as I think I've ever seen it. And yet you choose to kind of sit by and I guess we'll let the Reds win the division. I don't know.
Or the Cardinals, bring them back to life. Like, why are we giving
right.
CPR to the Cardinals? We should be getting the shovel out and burying them right now.
Yeah. And so that I think is just it's very odd. It's very hard for me to get a handle on. Okay. So you're very fixed on this. Well, I'll use his phrase, intelligent spending, or, wanting to function like kind of a mid-market team or have a mid-market attitude, I think is kind of more the way he put it. And not that anybody, you don't necessarily want them to act like the Mets, but there is a little bit of like, you've been sitting under the luxury tax now for several years. Even if you do touch that first tier, it's not as though it's going to cost you some tremendous amount of money. Like, you've got an extremely vulnerable division. You've got
the highest ticket prices in the league.
Right. You're asking fans to pay
your own television network. I don't know.
You have your own, right. Like your own network, you have all of these things. So what though, that just doesn't add up in my mind. And so I think that's where I think fans are justifiably frustrated. Sometimes like Ricketts is cheap feels a little reductive, but there is a point where it's like, well, yeah, hold on though, because you sold fans on the Marquee Sports Network based on this was going to funnel all this cash into the team, and yet in the years since the network has existed, there's been a whole lot of low budget rosters. So that's where I think like if there was an off season to kind of show fans like, hey, all right, now it's time to go out and put some money into this roster. This was it to me, because you came a game shy of the playoffs, one game. You had some talent there. You have guys out there and available. And so what are we waiting for? What's the holdup?
And you started the offseason by signing Craig Counsell and breaking managerial pay records and saying, hey, this set the tone that, hey, maybe the Cubs are going to do all the things you guys just described, and they're going to bury the division, and they're going to make a push.
When you sign Joe Madden, you also sign John Lester, right? I mean, that's how it's supposed to work.
So you set the tone with the Counsell signing, and then we sat around and watched all the action happen everywhere else, and say, well, what are the Cubs going to do? And even teams that weren't active in free agency were making big splashes in trades. And we still haven't seen the Cubs do that even. We haven't seen them say, you know what, we're going to be careful with our spending on the free agent market, but then take this farm system you've cultivated, weaponize it, and let's see some big splashes in trades. Go after some of those teams that are trying to unload some money. We've been banging the Pete Alonso drum here for the Mets and some other opportunities that we've seen out there. And all I hear is that like we're just gonna raid the Cleveland Guardians when they finally wave the white flag here.
And unless I'm reading this wrong, I mean, in terms of the 40-man roster and their the salary cap, I call it a salary cap, but you know what I mean, the luxury tax. It seems that the Cubs are over $30 million under what they spent last year. So they've got room to buy if they want to. And they still have time to do it. But, the number of people out there that you really would want to get to really move the needle is reduced. I mean, the number one free agent left is Cody Bellinger, which would be a replacement, not an addition.
This will get you back to almost zero.
Yeah, and then it's Blake Snell, and then it's Jordan Montgomery, and then Matt Chapman, who they don't seem to have interest in, and then Hader, and then Rhys Hoskins, and that's it for the top 20, free agents this year. After that, you start talking about guys who don't probably move the needle much. I mean, the JD Martinez, he's 100 years old or whatever. And maybe a Justin Turner on a 1-year deal. He's also close to 100. I mean, those guys, might be nice pieces here and there. People talk about Brandon Belt or people like that. But, if Tommy Pham is our next free agent signing, I'm not going to be happy. It's just, there just isn't a lot out there.
No, and the Cubs did make a trade. We do want to talk about that. They did acquire infielder Michael Busch and relief pitcher Yency Almonte from the Dodgers. They gave up a couple minor leaguers, Ferris and Hope. This is the kind of thing that I was hoping to see, giving up some prospects for a guy that they hope to play. Michael Busch being a one of the Dodgers' top prospects. Jared, this was exciting to see. It reminded me too that you can spend in free agency and have a good farm system like the Dodgers do. Cubs seem to feel they can only choose one or the other, but your excitement around Michael Busch coming to the team and being on the Cubs for opening day.
Yeah, we actually had the chance on Saturday at the convention to talk to him for a while. And yeah, I think there's a lot to like about this trade because on one hand, part of the reason why you stockpile a farm system is so that you have those resources to make trades like this. And you did, by all appearances, you went out and snagged one of their very best prospects. This guy looks, based on his minor league numbers for sure, looks pretty legit. You're talking about serious left-handed power, which is something that the Cubs desperately need. And if he does turn out to be their first baseman, and both Jed and Carter said that over the weekend, was this, we expect him to play first base. Then you've addressed, kind of going back to what I said about Imanaga, another significant hole in this roster, and that's first base. And so, yeah, if he turns out to be the guy that you think you're getting, this is a fantastic trade. However, you do have to acknowledge that he has a grand total of, I think it was 81 plate appearances in the major leagues last year. So just a brief stint that doesn't necessarily show you much, but that does leave open the reality that this guy might not pan out, because I don't need to tell anybody listening to this podcast that sometimes guys look really good in AAA, but never hack it in the majors.
That's why Matt Mervis is not our first baseman.
Can we just say then we're in agreement that this is a Rizzo for Cashner deal?
That would be something. Saying? That would be something.
It really, I mean, it would be, because you do have the other side of that is look back at what Rizzo did at his first look in the majors back in, 2011?
Sure.
And he looked very much the same way. So, yeah, while it's possible that this guy could bust, he could also turn out to be the next Anthony Rizzo.
I think this trade is fascinating because it seems like a trade of a young, very promising pitcher for a less young, promising hitter who's obviously the Cubs need players today, and the Dodgers don't need as many because they buy their players. So they can, stock up the farm system with guys who are going to be pitching in 2 years in the majors or 3 years, whereas the Cubs need to actually fill holes in their lineup for like 3 months from now when the season starts. So it's interesting in that regard. And hopefully it'll work out, because this seems to be in lieu of a free agent signing, one of the bats that they plan on integrating into their lineup in, I guess, in their eyes, in a way to replace some of what they've lost.
Yeah, it's definitely a great move here if this pans out. And I'm not one of those guys who's like, oh no, like the Cubs gave up too much with Jackson Ferris and these guys. It's too much. This is the time. I'm not one of those folks. I don't think you are either, Pat, who says we gotta hoard prospects. We want to see the Cubs keep all their best prospects and never trade them, and because we don't it's the time to move them is when they are, these when you have the depth in your system like you claim to have. Now is the time to move those guys for a piece that can help you now, like Michael Busch, and they need help. They're still trying to get back to zero. Does saying playing him at first base? Is this part of a Bellinger negotiation, and really he could be the third baseman, and Bellinger comes back to play first and center until PCA emerges?
Right, and then that is kind of the thing that I think you have to acknowledge is they're saying that now, but it's January, so there's so much that can change. And yeah, when you look at Michael Busch's defensive experience, he's spent a lot of time at third base as well. He's even played a little bit outfield. He played a ton of second base, but of course we're not worried about second base. So there is most definitely the possibility that this is all just hey, Cody, maybe we don't need you after all. And then they do sign him and you slide Michael Busch over to third, and that's going to work out just fine. Because the scenario that I've imagined, like you just described, Jeremy, is you sign Bellinger, you've got him in center field until PCA is ready. He comes, he's your center fielder. Cody Bellinger plays first. I think that works out pretty nicely. And if that does mean that Michael Busch slides over to third, that's the other spot in the infield that I think is a pretty major question mark, because Nick Madrigal played admirable defense. He deserves a ton of credit for developing defensively as a third baseman. The bat can be there at times, but his thing has always been like, are you ever going to get a full season out of this guy?
And will you hit the ball in the infield? Things like that.
Right. And then, we know what we have in Patrick Wisdom. You've got, the Christopher Morel question, which you could probably do a whole series of episodes on.
Yeah, wasn't he the starting third baseman like just a week ago? It seems like.
Right. And so now it's like, okay, well, given the current roster, maybe you go into spring training and you just tell Morel, hey, camp out at third. You're taking grounders there all spring. And maybe that's what works out. But there's still, point being, there's still a third base isn't exactly settled either. So if they do go out and get Bellinger, I think that can work out pretty nicely. You just move Busch over.
Yeah, none of those guys really strike me as guys who either have any experience or any quality time at third base in the past, right? I mean, they're Madrigal last year obviously had that kind of weird thing where he wasn't bad, but Wisdom's proven to not be a great third baseman, and I don't think we have any reason to believe that the other two are going to be good third basemen based on all the information we have to date. So maybe they'll get better, maybe they won't, but at least two of them can hit, which is nice. So you still have a DH, I suppose, right, to utilize, and if they don't go ahead and get Bellinger, or if PCA doesn't work out, there'll be room for people. The last thing I'm worried about is having too many bats and too many players in that lineup. It's more the opposite that I'm concerned about. So I'm sure they'll be able to figure something out.
Yeah, and if this is supposed to be a team that you expect to contend at least a little bit, you can't have this rotating group of third basemen of Madrigal and Morel and Wisdom. Like, that's, in my mind, that's not what a competitive team does. So you'd like to see them get it settled in some way.
And, and I said this last year, let Patrick Wisdom hit 10 home runs in April and just unceremoniously bench him for 2 months, because he's don't let him to regress to the mean. Just put him on the bench and take what you can get out of him, and then bring him back in the summer. That'd be my suggestion in Cubs. But no, seriously, I think this is what's going to happen when the Cubs don't, and it seems more and more likely the Cubs don't go and get a Matt Chapman at this point. They seem really big on some of their players in the minors this year, and I think the third baseman who or I don't even think he's a third baseman. I think a shortstop, but they're going to convert him to third. Is this Matt Shaw guy? What's your take on this whole thing? He was drafted in the first round, middle of the first round last year, and a lot of people have him penciled in as the starting third baseman within a couple months, like by the All-Star break. It seems very aggressive, but do you have any take on this, Jared? How serious that is, or what is he the reason why the Cubs would rather do a patchwork third base option for the next couple months and then hope that he can take over the reins there?
I would be very surprised if that's the approach, just because there's a lot riding on a guy who, drafted very recently, has limited minor league experience, has kind of only recently started taking full-time looks at third base. So to then pin, okay, he's going to be our third baseman of the future, so therefore we can just kind of make do with these other guys for a while. I'd be kind of surprised if that's really the approach that they're taking, unless, kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, financially, they're just kind of like, all right, we need to find an option within our system that we can make work at this position. And this seems to be the best path that we can take, because we aren't going to be able to go out and sign Matt Chapman or do something like that. So,
or they don't want to commit the years to it. So this is sort of the de facto thing. I mean, like you say, between Wisdom and Madrigal and Busch and Morel, I think they've gotten away with a lot worse before at third base for a season than those four. So, they didn't have any qualms about it last year. That's a better foursome than they had coming into last year. So it wouldn't surprise me or shock me if they did something like that, much in the way they remember when they had Mike Holt play third base for a little while until Bryant's defense.
Yeah, Bryant got his defense together. Yeah.
Finally met the clock for not having to give him arbitration a year earlier. So they've done worse.
Well, speaking of
so
Cubs, go ahead, Jared.
I was going to say, in that scenario, then that's if you think that Shaw is that potentially that kind of a player, then sure, why not just go with the third baseman that you have, and when you think it's time and he's ready, then you bring him up. But again, I don't know. I have trouble seeing it that way right now. But
yeah, me too.
Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'll be wrong.
I'm trying to see it through their eyes, because I don't see it through my eyes. So
I think my concern is that this is hey, here's the most cost-effective thing that we can do. So let's hope that works out.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And speaking of Cubs arbitration, they had arbitration settlements with the following players: Patrick Wisdom, $2.725 million; Nick Madrigal, $1.81 million; and then Tuckman for $1.95; Julian Merriweather, $1.175; Adbert Alzolay, $2.11 million; Mark Leiter Jr., $1.5 million; and Justin Steele for $4 million. This is grand total of $17 million in arbitration deals for all those players. So
not even one Hayward in price. That reminds me, speaking of Alzolay, Jared, what are you hearing about the Cubs in the bullpen? Because that is an area. I understand actually the concerns. I mean, I don't necessarily agree always with the approach, but I understand not wanting to, quote, block somebody at some position where you've got some young, untested player that you think is going to be great. But when it comes to pitching, you really have a lot more freedom, I think, to go out and get, whether it's a relief pitcher or a starting pitcher, because there's so many and they get hurt all the time. And, you never have to worry about having too many. And I think the Cubs are in a fantastic position with their bullpen where they don't have to worry about having too many quality arms, because they don't. They don't even have enough arms to fill out a bullpen right now. So what are they going to do? And is Alzolay, you think, the closer for next year? Or are they going to go out and try to wait out Josh Hader or somebody, or make a trade for the Guardians closer? I mean, what do you think the plan is here?
Well, if I had to bet on it, what I would bet on is that their focus in the bullpen is going to be on filling out some of those arms who can be the bridge from the starter to your back end of the bullpen guys like Alzolay. So for better or worse, it seems to be that they're banking on, hey, we saw Alzolay looked pretty good as the closer. So let's roll with that again. So if I had to make a prediction right now, it's that he's going to be their closer when the season starts, and we'll find out how that goes over the long term. I think he's got the stuff to do it. Like
Yeah.
I believe in him. But yeah, I don't see them getting like a backup option necessarily.
Well, I'll tell you this: if Drew Smiley is a setup man, I am going to watch those games with one eye closed. I just think that the bullpen itself, whether you get a closer or whether you get two other pitchers who you can count on in high leverage relief innings, they need something back there. I mean, they do have a plethora of guys like Assad and Wisniewski and whomever who can pitch a couple innings in the fifth and sixth. Somebody gets knocked around or whatever. You've got guys who can come in and give you innings, but I'm not confident that any of them are going to give you like late innings, late game innings, I guess. Do you think they're confident in that? Do you think they understand that they need to still go out and acquire some pitching for that moment? Or do you think they feel like they've got exactly what they need now?
No, I think that's going to be, along with, you hope, whether it's Bellinger or something, another bat in the lineup, I think that's going to be where we're going to see the most activity from them, because they have to know that the current bullpen is not going to cut it. I think that this Yency Almonte, who's a part of this Dodgers trade, is the kind of guy who they have really succeeded with in recent years, where you look at some of what Almonte has done. There's been some up and down in his career, but when he's looking good, he's looking really good. So I suspect that they believe they can tap into what he's done well, and there's potential he emerges as the setup guy or some, in one of those kinds of roles. But no, I really think that we're going to see some activity on that front. Going back to what I said earlier, though, I don't think it's going to be like hey, we're going to sign Josh Hader or trade for somebody. I know, they were connected with the closer from the Guardians.
Class A or whatever.
Class A, yeah. I'm not anticipating that kind of a move, but this bullpen's not a finished product. And
I too am hopeful that the Dodgers pitcher will do well. He has no options left, so it's going to be, it's another. You guys probably don't remember this, but back in the day, Cubs had a guy named Juan Cruz who they were very high on, but basically just ran out of options on him and ended up having to set him free, and he didn't do very much afterwards, a little bit, but that's with a guy who's up and down, that's the concern, is you can't just send him back to the minors to get straight. So you really have to hope that he's good from the beginning.
Yeah, and especially in this case, because you're taking him on with no options, so it's really got to be this has to work. The name that came to mind for me was, not too long ago, Dylan Maples, who
sure.
Just magnificent slider, but he kept coming back up and down from the minors, and it just was never there. So that's what it's a pretty high risk with Almonte, just because if he doesn't pan out, you kind of have to say you got to eat it, so to speak, on that part of the trade. So again, that's a big part of why I think there's more that's going to happen for the bullpen.
I predict by season's end he'll be pitching for the Royals, who will embrace him with open arms if the Cubs ever do cut him, or someone of that ilk. Maybe even the Pirates.
Yeah, someone that we always hoped we were following closely. We always hoped to be a key part of this bullpen was Cody Hoyer. When he was non-tendered, I was pretty disappointed after all his injury struggles. Tommy John surgery, then broke his elbow for another surgery. So
I always felt breaking your elbow as a pitcher is probably a really bad.
Probably not great. No. So
no, we had super high hopes for him. He was, frankly, in that trade for Kimbrel.
Yep.
forget Madrigal. I was hoping that if Hoyer had been able to emerge as a setup man, or at least your seventh inning guy for 3 years, your Bobby Hoyer, if you will, I would have felt that trade was worth it. But sadly, for reasons that had nothing to do with his ability or the Cubs' evaluation of it, it just didn't work out.
So, Jared, I do want to get your take on Cubs convention. You were a busy man. You had a lot of interviews to do as part of your commitments with CHGO. Tell us how that went for you, and kind of who was the most interesting interview that you had over the course of the weekend.
Yeah, it was. Despite the weather forecast and questions about how that was going to impact things, it felt like a very normal Cubs convention, which is, to me, is always a lot of fun. Friday started off early that afternoon with the Shota Imanaga press conference, which I talked about. And then we had our usual Friday afternoon media time with some of the players, and that's much more informal, which is kind of nice. There's, they do have some times when you're pulling guys aside for formal interviews, but there's also just opportunity to just like talk to people. And actually there was a group of us that just stood and talked to Craig Counsell for a while. No recorders, no nothing. It was just a group of guys talking, which, it was nice to have that opportunity. Because I feel like when you get to talk to somebody in that way, you're getting to know each other in a better way, of course, than just that transactional, I'm interviewing you kind of a relationship. So it was nice to be able to do that.
What was your initial impression with Counsell versus, say, David Ross? Like, what are the differences to compare and contrast?
Well, it's tough with Ross just because when I started out with him, we were still doing just Zoom stuff. So I didn't really talk to Ross in person until, he was a little ways into his managerial tenure. But Counsell just his persona is very relaxed, very sure of himself without necessarily seeming cocky. David Ross, I got a lot of like intensity from, but like not bad intensity. I could see why guys liked playing for him. There were times when he would talk when I would think, man, I could go out and hit a home run right now. So I liked David Ross, but the energy is definitely very different. Again, not like good or bad either way. Just these are personality wise, these guys are pretty different from each other. But yeah, I think the rest of the convention on Saturday, we have as media, there's a lot more access than we used to get, which is helpful because we can spend more time talking to people. And we at CHGO did some one-on-one stuff where we pulled guys aside and talked to them. And I have to say, I was a part of the Mike Tauchman interview and really, really enjoyed talking to him. That is a thoughtful, intelligent guy. We talked to him about hitting and just his approach to that and his philosophy about like learning as a hitter, which was really interesting. He told
almost
us
guaranteed to be a future coach, right? Because
yes,
he won't make millions of dollars as a player, but he's got the kind of mind that seems really tailor-made for coaching.
Absolutely. Because one of the questions I asked him in the interview was, I said, hey, I noticed in the locker room that you're talking about hitting to different guys almost every time I'm there. And asked him like, is this more of a sounding board kind of thing, or are you picking people's brains? And just like the response, and you can see it on the CHGO Cubs podcast that aired on Tuesday. You can watch his response there because you're exactly right. He comes across like a guy who, when his time as a player is done, you're going to want to learn from what he knows. And he told us this great story about Yan Gomes. He used Yan Gomes as an example and talked about how Gomes would go into the batting cage before every game and practice a very specific kind of swing. He said he'd go out there and he'd give you the we need a game-winning single swing right here. And he said Gomes goes out there and practices that swing over and over again every single day. And then Tauchman was like, and look at his late game numbers, and it translates. Like, he works on that on a daily basis and then comes through when the team needs it.
And yet in real life, it feels like he hits more clutch home runs. So, you know,
I know but you know, it's just funny to, like, the things that players notice, is always interesting to me, especially what they notice about each other and the work and the things that their teammates are doing. So I really like, he was a great conversation. You know, it just, that's a guy who, whatever happens with him after his playing career, I think is worth keeping an eye on.
It's funny too, because Tuchman's catch in St. Louis completely turned around and changed the Cubs season last year. I couldn't imagine if they ended up losing that game and that series.
Changed our evening, Jeremy, as you recall.
I was with you that evening. Yes. What a different path that whole season could have took if Tuchman didn't make that game-saving catch.
And we asked him about that. That was one of the first things. It might have been the first question we asked him. And just hearing him talk about the catch, he's just so, like, calm about it. Because we asked him, you know, my question was like, all right, you think about your personal highlights for the year. Where does that rank? Is that for you? Do you reflect back, and is that, like, in your mind, your best moment? And he kind of played it off like, yeah, you know, it's just another catch, like that sort of thing. And I'm like, dude, you made one of the best catches ever. You know, not just in 2023, but one of the best outfield catches ever. But just, yeah, so relaxed and so chill when he talked about it. But that's, like, speaking of, like, demeanor, he is like a very zen, stoic kind of guy. That dude is calm all the time.
He probably feels bad because had he not made that catch, Cubs would have traded Bellinger, probably a couple other people, gotten some prospects. They would have had a lot more pressure on them to make the playoffs this year. They would have spent more in free agency. Who knows? But no, I think that was certainly I think one of the highlights of the year. In fact, that 2-week period seemed to have a lot of them. The Morel Grand Slam, was it Grand Slam against the White Sox? I think it was, right? Just a couple of them in a row there that at least gave us, in what I think, I mean, Jared, you've covered the Cubs for quite a few years now, but was last year the most up and down year you can remember lately? I mean, it just felt like the highs and the lows were all over the place.
Oh, absolutely. It was hard to believe that all of that was in the same season.
They're basically a 500 team, more or less, but it felt
right.
like they were good, and then it felt like they were terrible, and then it felt like they were great, and then it felt like they were an abysmal flop. I mean, this was just up and down.
Yeah, I mean, they had times when they played like a team that was going to finish 20 games below 500 and a team that was going to finish 20 games above. You know, you saw both of those things within the same season and within, like, weeks of each other. You know, even going from where things stood in mid-May to a month or so later, and it was like, this team's trajectory has changed so much. They look so much different. It was by far the most roller coaster season I've ever experienced. Both as just back before I was covering the team, but also in the years since I started covering them, I've never experienced a year that felt so up and down as that one. Because then you get the highs of, like, July, August, but then September was such they were back to being the team, kind of like the team that we saw in May, and at a time when they needed the wins the most and just couldn't come up with them, and then ultimately, cost themselves a playoff spot.
Well, any final thoughts on the Cubs convention?
I would say, I think for anybody who has not gone, it's a worthwhile experience, because it's such a great mixture of like getting to see and interact with other fans, which I think is, that's such a cool part of it, is just seeing people hanging out, talking to each other. But you also, it's a little bit of like the Cubs of right now, but also for people who have been Cubs fans for a long time, you're going to get a chance to get an autograph from that guy who was on the 1984 team that you couldn't get his autograph back when you were 10, that now there he is and you can go talk to him. I met a guy who was waiting around because he wanted Rick Sutcliffe's autograph. Because he said exactly that. Like, I'm stealing
Just go to
his
Murphy's
words.
for God's sake. You can
He
get
said,
them there.
I didn't tell him that. I'm like, it's easier to get than you think, but just go to the right places. But yeah, like, for longtime fans to get to be able to interact with some of those guys and to be there when like the Aramis Ramirez's and the, Kerry Woods get into the Cubs Hall of Fame, like those are guys that not that long ago you were watching in a Cubs uniform, and now here they are again.
Loved the video that they did for the Aramis and Kerry Wood inductions to the Cubs Hall of Fame. I thought that was tremendously well done.
Yeah, I love that they incorporated their sons and got their sons involved in that. Like, that was such a cool touch. That's something that they've always done well, I think, is that kind of thing. So it was really cool, and we got a chance to talk to both of those guys after that ceremony and just, touch base with them again and hear their stories. And I actually asked Aramis, I said, because he mentioned like, hey, I'm a Cubs fan. I still watch and follow this team. So I said, who on the team do you enjoy watching the most now? And right away, he said Nico Horner, which I thought was pretty cool. Thinking about the third baseman of however many years ago, still following the team and enjoying watching the guy who we're all enjoying watch play second base now. I thought that was pretty cool.
Interestingly, he follows a singles hitter who plays good defense and steals bases. I guess it was sort of whereas he might be more of a power hitter who, was fine defensively, but not Nico Horner quality, who hopefully didn't run too much, but could hit the hell out of the ball. It's interesting that's who he likes to watch.
Aramis was so fun to watch. What a great Cubs tenure. I mean, when they were able to get him from the Pirates, what a signing!
It's so amazing. He was so good with the Pirates. You
So
forget.
good.
Like I was looking at his stats after we talked earlier today, Jeremy. He had over 30 home runs with the Pirates just 2 years before the Cubs got him, and was young and was they just fleeced them. I don't think you could ever make that trade today, could you?
No, not even close. That's just was an incredible trade at the time. He was a great player for the Cubs. I mean, how many times he was when you first moved into to your condo, Pat? You would
the day I moved in,
you would hear the Aramis Ramirez home runs.
Yeah, that's when I learned that from the back bedroom I could hear the crowd on home runs from the front when it was an important game like that, because the whole building was shaking.
Yeah, outstanding. So much fun. So great to hear. And I do want to leave a couple minutes here, Pat, for you to talk about the 1984 Cubs. Jared mentioned the 1984 Cubs. I know you had something to say about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I plan to do this year, as we watch the Cubs hopefully find their way on the path towards playoffs, is do a little bit of a retrospective of the 1984 Cubs and how their season progressed as our season progresses this year. And the reason I chose them, in addition to the fact that it is the 40th year anniversary of the 84 Cubs, which is shocking in its own right, is that I really do feel like the 84 Cubs were one of the 5 seminal Cubs teams, Cubs years of the last 50 years, of the last half century, maybe longer. And I say that acknowledging that the 98 Cubs, the 03 Cubs, the 2015 Cubs, and of course the 2016 Cubs would also be in sort of that rarefied air category, not just because of how well they did, but how they kind of changed either the fans' expectations or other things in a significant way. And the 84 Cubs had an impact on getting lights down the road. They had an impact on Wrigleyville as a neighborhood, frankly, and it was, that season the Cubs drew an extra 500,000 fans more than they had in any year in recent memory, and so you saw the neighborhood sort of transform as the Cubs transformed. So I want to focus on the '84 Cubs, and I'm just going to start today with just a few minutes of sort of background on the '84 Cubs. Jeremy, you were too young to remember this, and I just sort of know it, but not as an adult, obviously. But in June of 1981, the Tribune Company purchased the Cubs from the Wrigley family. And part of the deal was they hired Dallas Green to be their executive vice president, GM. He was from the Phillies. The Phillies had won the World Series in 1980. So that was a big deal to get somebody like him. And the goal was to professionalize the Cubs and to make it a more of a better organization / business rather than the family-owned kind of ragtag crew that they had before. And of course, Dallas Green, in his first year as GM, hired none other than Lee Elia to be the Cubs manager. Lee Elia, the famous Les Grobstein, recorded comments about Cubs fans, which I'm sure we can play in April or whatever the anniversary of that day is. But Lee Elia lasted like a year and a half and was fired. But right before the 1984 season started, the Cubs hired a new manager, a guy named Jim Frey, who had been the Kansas City Royals manager. And he had won 97 games with the Royals just a couple years before. So again, you've got a general manager who's won a World Series. You've got a manager who, was managing George Brett, for God's sake, and was battling the Yankees and was, considered like a legit manager. And that was big news for the Cubs because the Cubs hadn't finished over 500 in 12 years. So expectations may not have been high for a lot of people coming into the season, but the Cubs that year had begun already to kind of make some of the moves that would, I think, set them up for future success. You may recall before the 1983 season, the Cubs traded Evanda Jesus, fan favorite, but they were able to receive from the Phillies. It was like the first major move of the Dallas Green era, a veteran shortstop that they were pining for named Larry Boa, plus a throw-in sort of infielder, maybe center fielder, they had no idea, by the name of Ryan Sandberg. And they moved him to third base because they didn't know what to do with him. And by '84, they moved him to second base because they had acquired none other than Ron Cey from the Dodgers. So, as a Cubs fan in 1984, you're going into a season where you had a famous Dodger playing third base, a famous Philly playing shortstop. And, there was some excitement there, and where they passed their prime a little bit. And veterans, of course, that's the only type the Cubs would ever get in those days. But still, the Cubs had a lot to look forward to. Although they were coming off a 91-loss season and hadn't, played well in over a decade, so I think expectations were a little bit muted. But headed into January of 1984, at this date, in fact, the Cubs were maybe predicted to be probably about a 75-76 win team. We'll get into some of the changes that occurred even before the end of spring training and then throughout the season as we go along. But I will just leave you with this note. Our seats, season tickets in the 100 section behind home plate in 1984 cost $8, tax included. So there you go. If only we had a time machine and the money in our pockets today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the '84 Cubs, how they constructed the team, and how the season progressed, some of the trades they made during the season, and just how they played, because it really was a magical year, really the first magical year since 1969, and one that really catapulted the neighborhood in terms of construction and business and people moving in because of the Cubs. Like, the Cubs became an attraction that people wanted to live near, as opposed to just a neighborhood baseball team that just happened to be there. So that's the plan.
Yeah, the '84 Cubs were my first, childhood exposure to baseball. Like, that's the first childhood baseball memories I have. I don't know if it's before your time, Jared.
Yeah, I was all of 2 years old that season. So I would say the first team that I have any real recollection of is a few years after that. So yeah, 1984, definitely before my time.
And with that, we are going to wrap it up. I look forward to having a deeper dive into 1984 Cubs as the season progresses. But we're going to wrap up this week. Jared Wyllys, always a pleasure getting to catch up with you, longtime friend of the show. Please remind our listeners how they can subscribe to The Dugout and read all of your content on the internet.
Yeah, you can find The Dugout on Substack. So it's just jaredwillis.substack.com. Or I link each time I write something new, I'll put it out on Twitter. So if you go through my feed, you'll find one just from a couple of days ago. So pretty easy to find that way. And there are, if you want to sign up and get just the free posts only, then you get one of those every other week. But then I've also, for the last year, I've been writing posts for paid subscribers as well. So that's an option if you're looking for some stuff where there's a little more specific focus on the goings on with the Cubs and the White Sox, whereas my usual dugout posts are just a little more general baseball and life thoughts. So depending on what you're looking for, I've got both things there.
Your musings, if you will.
Musings, yes, I like that word.
And we are paid subscribers, of course, to Jared's Substack.
I appreciate
that.
It's
fantastic, and
it is.
We made sure we had a few free subscriptions to hand out last year, and we did that to our Patreon subscribers, the people who support our podcast at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. Every single dollar that's contributed there goes right back into the podcast, helps us keep the show ad-free for another season as we go into our 10th year covering the Cubs here. Then we don't have to read ads, and everybody wins. So continue to support the show there, continue to keep us, keep the lights on, and again, every single penny goes right back to the show. If you can't support the show financially in these times, we understand as well. Make sure you're telling your Cub fan friends about the show. Show them how to subscribe to the podcast. We're available on all podcatchers of choice. And we also are going to be posting to the YouTube channel, so you can also throw us a like, subscribe, all that stuff over. Search for Wrigleyville Nation Podcast there. All the links that I described, the entire back catalog of this podcast is available at the website wrigleyvillenation.com. Make sure you're following us on all the social media platforms. We're on Threads and Blue Sky and X and we're wherever, Instagram, anywhere socials are happening. You can find us.
How about the Facebook? Are we on the Facebook?
We are. I'll get there in a second. At Wrigleyville Nat. At Wrigleyville Nat for all the socials. Also, facebook.com/Wrigleyville Nation as well. And with that, we're going to wrap it up and call it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening. We'll talk to you again next time.